June 16, 1944. Just after midnight on the island of Saipan. The air hangs thick with the smell of crushed coral, burnt diesel, and the metallic tang of blood still drying in the sand. Somewhere beyond the dark ridgelines, the Pacific surf pounds the western beaches where the Americans landed 5 days earlier. Closer, in the narrow coastal plain near Charan Kanoa, engines cough to life. One after another. The low, throaty rumble of Type 95 Hago light tanks rolls through the night like distant thunder. You can almost feel the vibration in the ground as the 9th Tank Regiment forms up. 30-odd of these small, angular machines, some still painted in the faded camouflage of earlier campaigns, nose forward through the darkness. Inside each, 3 men sit cramped together in a space no larger than a closet. The driver hunches over his levers. The gunner peers through a narrow vision slit. The commander stands half exposed in the turret, one hand on the hatch rim, the other resting near the 37mm gun's breech. Sweat slides down their faces. The tropical heat has not cooled with the night, it only grows heavier with the weight of what is coming. These crews trust the thin steel plates around them. They have trusted them for years. The Hago carried them through the dusty roads of China, the rubber plantations of Malaya, the jungle tracks of the Philippines. It was fast. It was reliable. It had never failed them when the enemy's anti-tank guns were scarce and their own tanks even scarcer. Tonight they believe it will carry them once more, through the American lines, into the beachhead, and toward a victory that might still reverse the tide of the Marianas. The order comes. The tanks lurch forward. Tracks clatter over coral and black volcanic soil. Machine gun fire from marine positions begins to stitch the darkness ahead. Red tracers arcing, green tracers answering. Then the heavier hammering starts, the deep, rhythmic thudding of Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns. The sound is different from the lighter .30 caliber chatter the Japanese crews have grown used to. It is louder, more deliberate, like a blacksmith's hammer striking an anvil again and again. A Hago near the front of the formation jolts. Sparks bloom across its left side. Inside, the commander hears a sharp metallic crack, then another. He ducks instinctively. A third impact punches through the armor near the driver's compartment. A bright, white-hot flash fills the tiny interior. The driver screams once and goes silent. Smoke and the sharp stink of burnt paint and blood flood the fighting compartment. The tank shudders to a stop, turret still pointed uselessly forward. Other crews see the same thing happening around them. Round after round from the American heavy machine guns is punching clean through the Hago's armor as if it were sheet metal. At ranges under 200 meters, the armor-piercing .50 caliber bullets find every weak point, the sides, the rear, even the frontal plates that were never meant to stop anything heavier than a rifle bullet. Crews who moments earlier had felt the familiar protection of their steel shells now feel only vulnerability. The armor that had carried them through years of war is failing in the dark, under the hammer of a weapon they never expected to fear. The advance staggers. Some tanks press on, guns flashing. Others halt, hatches flying open as men tumble out into the fire-swept night. The Marines keep firing. The .50 calibers do not stop. In that moment, on the black coral plain of Saipan, the question forms itself in the minds of the surviving Japanese tankers, even as they fight for their lives: how did we come to this? How did a tank we trusted for so long become something that a machine gun could kill? The answer does not begin on Saipan. It begins more than a decade earlier, in the design bureaus and proving grounds of a Japan that still believed the next war would look very different from the one now unfolding in the Marianas. Japan did not set out to build a failure. It set out to build a tank that could keep pace with an army that expected to fight across the vast, uneven landscapes of East Asia. The Type 95 Hago was born from that practical ambition. Designers at the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries plant and the Army's own ordnance bureaus received clear requirements. The new light tank must be fast enough to support rapidly advancing infantry, light enough to cross soft ground and narrow bridges, simple enough for mass production in factories that were still learning the rhythms of modern industry, and cheap enough that Japan could field them in meaningful numbers rather than a handful of expensive showpieces. Armor was secondary. Speed and reliability came first. The finished vehicle weighed just over 7 tons. Its riveted and welded plates were thin. 12 mm at the thickest points on the front, less on the sides and rear. That was deliberate. Extra steel meant extra weight, and extra weight meant slower movement across the rice paddies, riverbanks, and mountain tracks that Japanese planners believed would define the next war. The Hago's diesel engine pushed it to nearly 45 km/h on roads and a respectable 25 cross-country. Its tracks were wide enough for soft terrain. Its silhouette was low. Its 37 mm gun and twin machine guns gave it enough firepower to deal with the light fortifications and poorly armed opponents Japan expected to meet. Inside the cramped turret and hull, 3 men shared every duty. The commander loaded, spotted, and directed. The gunner fired. The driver steered. Radios were rare luxuries in the early models, most communication happened by flag or shouted order. Maintenance was straightforward. Parts were interchangeable. A trained crew could keep the machine running with tools that fit in a small kit. In the context of the early 1930s, these choices made sense. Japan's strategic horizon was China and the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia. The enemy was expected to be infantry-heavy, short on modern anti-tank weapons, and even shorter on tanks of their own. A fast, agile light tank that could appear where the enemy least expected it, support the infantry's breakthrough, and then vanish again before heavier fire could concentrate, that was the tool the army believed it needed. Heavy armor and large-caliber guns belonged to the European armies fighting on open plains. Japan's designers looked at their own maps and chose mobility instead. The first prototypes rolled out in 1934. Production began the following year. By the time the Second Sino-Japanese War erupted in 1937, the Hago was already entering service in numbers. Crews who received the new tanks found them responsive, mechanically dependable, and far superior to the older Type 89 mediums they sometimes replaced. The machine did exactly what it had been asked to do. It moved quickly. It crossed difficult ground. It stayed running when other vehicles bogged down or broke. And when it met Chinese forces that possessed few anti-tank guns and almost no armor of their own, the Hago's thin plates were more than enough. This was not a tank designed for a long war of attrition against industrial peers. It was a tank designed for the war Japan thought it would fight, fast, opportunistic, and decided by maneuver rather than by the thickness of steel. For several years, the battlefield seemed to confirm that judgment. Yet every design decision carries a hidden cost. The same thin armor that kept the Hago light and affordable also left it vulnerable to weapons that had not yet appeared in significant numbers on the Asian mainland. The same 3-man crew that kept the vehicle small and inexpensive also meant one man was forever trying to do the work of 2. The same emphasis on simplicity that made production easy also limited how far the design could grow when the nature of war itself began to change. In the mid-1930s those costs still lay in the future. Japanese tank crews climbing into their new Hagos felt only the confidence of a machine that matched the mission. They could not yet see the gap that was already opening between the tank they trusted and the kind of war that was coming. That confidence would only deepen in the years that followed, as early victories in China and the opening campaigns of the Pacific War turned the Type 95 from a practical tool into a symbol of Japanese armored success. From 1937 onward, Type 95 Hagos rolled into the fighting alongside Japanese infantry columns. Against Chinese nationalist and communist forces that possessed few modern tanks and even fewer effective anti-tank guns, the little machines proved devastating. Their 37mm guns punched through the thin walls of sandbagged strongpoints. Their machine guns swept trenches and roads. Their speed allowed them to outflank positions that slower, heavier vehicles could never have reached. Chinese soldiers, armed mostly with rifles, machine guns, and the occasional outdated field piece, watched the Hagos appear out of the haze, fire a few rounds, and vanish again before concentrated resistance could form. Crews returned from these actions with stories that hardened into doctrine. The tank was reliable. It did not bog down in the mud the way older models had. Its diesel engine kept running when gasoline machines sputtered. The thin armor shrugged off small arms fire and most of the light artillery the Chinese could bring to bear. In the eyes of the men who fought inside them, the Hago was not merely adequate, it was the right weapon for the war Japan was winning. That reputation crossed the sea when the Pacific War began. In December 1941 and the first months of 1942, Japanese tank units spearheaded the rapid advances through Malaya and the Philippines. In Malaya, Hagos and the slightly heavier Type 97 Chiha mediums moved down the narrow roads and rubber plantations with a speed that stunned British and Commonwealth defenders. The British had few tanks of their own and even fewer anti-tank guns properly positioned. Japanese armor exploited every gap, appearing on flanks, cutting roads, and sowing panic among troops who had expected a slower, more deliberate enemy. In the Philippines the pattern repeated. Japanese light tanks supported infantry assaults against American and Filipino positions that were short on armor-piercing weapons and often caught off balance by the speed of the Japanese advance. The Hago's low silhouette and mobility let it navigate the uneven terrain and dense vegetation where larger vehicles would have struggled. Crews who had already tasted success in China now added new victories to their experience. They learned that a well-handled light tank, used aggressively and in coordination with infantry, could unhinge defensive lines that looked strong on paper. Success against weaker or poorly equipped opposition can make a weapon appear more future-proof than it really is. The Hago's early triumphs did exactly that. Japanese tankers came to believe that the qualities which had served them so well, speed, mechanical simplicity, and enough firepower to handle the enemies they had met, would continue to serve them against any foe. The thin armor that had never been seriously tested by modern anti-tank guns was still regarded as sufficient protection. The three-man crew arrangement that forced the commander to load, observe, and direct at the same time was accepted as the normal way of fighting. Radios remained scarce because voice and flag signals had been enough in the fast-moving battles of 1941 and 1942. Inside the tanks, confidence became habit. A commander who had driven his Hago from the Chinese border to the Singapore Causeway, or from Lingayen Gulf to the approaches of Bataan, carried with him the memory of roads opened, positions overrun, and enemy guns silenced. He trusted the steel around him because that steel had never failed him when it mattered. He trusted the 37mm gun because it had always found a target worth hitting. He trusted the machine itself because it had carried him through campaigns that older, slower tanks could never have completed. That trust was genuine. It was earned under fire. And it was incomplete. The enemies the Hago had defeated possessed neither the industrial depth nor the modern anti-tank arsenal that waited further east and north. The same qualities that made the tank a success in China and the early Pacific campaigns would soon meet opponents who had studied those campaigns, learned from them, and prepared accordingly. But in the spring of 1942, with Singapore fallen and the Philippines collapsing, those harder tests still lay ahead. Japanese tank crews looked at their Hagos and saw proven instruments of victory. The battlefield had not yet shown them how fragile that proof really was. Yet the first clear warning that the Hago's advantages were limited had already arrived 3 years earlier, far to the north, on the border between Japanese-held Manchuria and Soviet Mongolia. In the summer of 1939, at Khalkhin Gol, Japanese forces clashed with the Red Army in a series of battles that revealed exactly what modern armored warfare looked like when both sides brought tanks to the field. The Japanese committed Type 95 Hagos and Type 89 mediums against Soviet BT-5 and BT-7 fast tanks, and later against the heavier T-26 and the new T-34 prototypes that began to appear. The difference in protection and firepower was immediate and brutal. Soviet 45mm guns punched through the Ha-Go's thin plates at ranges where the Japanese 37mm struggled to reply effectively. The riveted armor that had shrugged off Chinese rifle fire and light artillery now cracked and splintered under dedicated anti-tank rounds. Japanese crews watched their tanks burn after single hits that would have been shrugged off by better protected vehicles. The Soviets' better optics, radios, and coordinated tactics compounded the problem. Japanese tanks, often operating with limited communication and in smaller numbers, found themselves outmaneuvered and outgunned in open tank versus tank fighting. The lesson was visible to anyone who looked closely. Against an opponent who possessed modern tanks and the doctrine to use them, the Ha-Go's light armor and modest gun became serious liabilities. Mobility still mattered, but mobility alone could not compensate for the inability to withstand or return effective fire. Japanese after-action reports noted the deficiencies. Some officers argued for thicker armor, larger guns, and better radios. A few prototypes of improved designs began to appear on drawing boards. Yet the warning did not produce a complete transformation of Japanese armored forces. Several reasons combined to blunt its impact. First, Khalkhin Gol was a border conflict, not a war for national survival. Japan's strategic attention remained fixed on China and the southern resource areas. The Army's primary mission was still infantry-centric, and tanks were expected to support that mission rather than fight independent armored battles. Second, industrial capacity was limited. Producing heavier, better-armed tanks in large numbers would have required steel, engines, and factory space that Japan preferred to allocate to ships, aircraft, and the existing light tank lines already in production. Third, the institutional culture of the Imperial Japanese Army favored aggressive spirit and rapid maneuver over material superiority. Many officers believed that superior training, courage, and tactical skill could offset technological gaps, an attitude that had seemed validated by earlier successes in China. As a result, the Ha-Go continued in production with only modest improvements. The basic design, thin armor, 3-man crew, 37mm gun, remained the backbone of Japanese light armor. Newer medium tanks like the Type 97 Chiha received better guns in some variants, but the overall force structure stayed light and numerous rather than heavy and well protected. Radios remained scarce. Combined arms coordination with artillery and aircraft stayed underdeveloped compared with the doctrines emerging in Europe and the Soviet Union. The men who would later fight on Saipan carried the memory of China and the early Pacific victories more vividly than the distant reports from the Mongolian border. Khalkhin Gol had shown that Japanese tanks could be vulnerable. It had not convinced the army that the vulnerability was decisive enough to demand a wholesale change of course. When the Pacific War began 2 years later, the same Ha-Gos that had struggled against Soviet armor would once again face enemies who possessed neither the numbers nor the quality of tanks the Red Army had fielded in 1939. Early victories would once more mask the underlying problem. The warning had been given. It had not been fully heard. When the Pacific War opened, those early victories arrived with such speed and completeness that the warning from Khalkhin Gol seemed almost irrelevant. In Malaya, Japanese tank columns raced down the long, narrow peninsula faster than British planners had thought possible. The Ha-Gos and their supporting mediums exploited every road, every gap between rubber trees, every moment of hesitation in the Commonwealth defenses. British and Indian units, short on anti-tank guns and almost entirely without tanks of their own, found their positions turned or overrun before they could organize a coherent response. The same pattern held in the Philippines. Japanese light tanks supported the landings at Lingayen Gulf and the subsequent drive south, moving through terrain and weather that would have slowed heavier machines. American and Filipino forces possessed a handful of light tanks and limited anti-tank weapons, most of them poorly positioned or already committed elsewhere. Surprise, mobility, and the absence of serious armored opposition allowed the Ha-Go to perform exactly as its designers had intended. Yet these successes rested on a narrow set of circumstances. The terrain favored light, agile vehicles. The enemy possessed neither the numbers nor the quality of anti-tank guns needed to stop them. Coordination between Japanese infantry, tanks, and supporting artillery was good enough for the tasks at hand, and the defenders were often caught off balance by the sheer tempo of the advance. Under those conditions the Ha-Go looked formidable. Its thin armor was rarely tested by weapons that could defeat it. Its 37mm gun found targets it could destroy. Its speed delivered shock at the decisive moment. The distinction mattered. The tank was succeeding, but that did not mean it was competitive with the best armored forces of the era. Against an opponent who brought modern anti-tank guns in quantity, who possessed tanks of comparable or greater power, and who fought with the benefit of radios, air support, and deep logistical reserves, the same machine would face a very different calculation. The victories in Malaya and the Philippines hid that calculation from view. They allowed Japanese commanders and crews to believe that the tools which had worked so well against one set of enemies would continue to work against any set of enemies. Institutional momentum reinforced the illusion. Production lines were already tooled for the Ha-Go and its close relatives. Training programs emphasized the aggressive tactics that had produced results. After-action reports celebrated the speed of the advances rather than probing the vulnerabilities that had never been seriously exposed. The memory of Khalkhin Gol, already 2 years old by the time Singapore fell, faded against the brighter glare of new triumphs. Officers who might have pushed harder for thicker armor or larger guns found their arguments diluted by the evidence of success. By the time Japanese forces stood victorious across Southeast Asia, the Type 95 had become more than a light tank. It had become a symbol of the Army's ability to overcome material disadvantages through speed, spirit, and skill. Crews who had driven their Ha-Gos from the Chinese front to the tip of the Malay Peninsula carried that belief into every subsequent campaign. They trusted the armor around them because that armor had never failed them when the enemy was the kind of enemy they had grown used to facing. The war, however, was already changing. Across the Pacific, an industrial power of a different scale was mobilizing. It was building tanks, guns, and ammunition in quantities Japan could not match. It was studying the lessons of every early Japanese victory and preparing responses that would strip away the advantages of surprise and mobility. When the two forces finally met in strength on the islands of the Central Pacific, the Ha-Go would no longer be fighting the war it had been designed for. It would be fighting a war that had moved far beyond the assumptions of the early 1930s. On Saipan, that new reality was about to arrive with crushing force. On Saipan in June 1944, that new reality stood waiting in the dark. 5 days after the American landings, the Japanese garrison prepared its largest armored counterattack of the Pacific War. The 9th Tank Regiment, reinforced by remaining tanks from other units, gathered what serviceable Ha-Gos and a handful of mediums it still possessed. Roughly 30 to 40 vehicles, far fewer than the numbers Japan had once fielded in China or Malaya, formed up in the night near the coastal plain. Their crews were veterans of earlier campaigns or newly arrived replacements who had absorbed the same doctrine of aggressive movement. They still trusted the machines around them. The thin armor, the 37mm guns, the familiar diesel roar, all of it felt like the tools that had carried Japan through years of victory. But the battlefield they now faced bore almost no resemblance to the ones that had shaped that trust. Across the island, the United States had landed a force of overwhelming material strength. 2 Marine divisions and an Army division held the beachhead, backed by naval gunfire, carrier aircraft, and a logistical pipeline that delivered ammunition, fuel, and replacements in quantities the Japanese could only imagine. Anti-tank guns, 37mm, 57mm, and the newer 75mm pieces, were dug in and registered. Sherman tanks of the Marine tank battalions waited in reserve or already prowled the perimeter. Browning .50 caliber machine guns, mounted on vehicles, in fixed positions, and on the decks of landing craft still offshore, covered every approach with interlocking fire. Artillery batteries stood ready to drop concentrations on any movement detected by observation posts or star shells. This was no longer a war of rapid advances against thinly held lines. It was a war of industrial mass. The Americans possessed more of everything that mattered. More guns, more armor, more radios, more shells, more ability to replace what was lost. The Japanese tanks were about to advance into a defensive system designed specifically to stop them. Just after midnight on the 16th, the order went out. Engines started. The Hagos lurched forward through the darkness, tracks grinding over coral and black soil, heading toward the marine positions near Charan-Kanoa and the coastal road. Commanders stood in their turrets, scanning the night for the first signs of the enemy. Gunners checked their 37mm rounds. Drivers steered by the faint glow of exhaust and the occasional flash of distant gunfire. The plan was simple and familiar: break through the American lines, reach the beaches, destroy the supply dumps and landing craft, and throw the invaders back into the sea. For a few minutes the advance seemed to follow the old pattern. The tanks moved with the same speed that had once unhinged Commonwealth and Filipino defenses. Infantry followed as best they could through the broken ground. Then the American response began. Star shells burst overhead, turning the night into a harsh, flickering day. Tracers reached out from the marine lines, first the lighter .30 caliber streams, then the deeper, heavier hammering of the .50 calibers. Anti-tank guns opened fire. Somewhere farther back, artillery began to fall. The Japanese tanks pressed on. They had done this before. They expected the armor around them to hold long enough to close the distance and deliver their own fire. What they did not yet fully understand was that the weapons waiting for them had changed the equation. The war the Hago had been built to fight was over. The war it now faced had already moved beyond the limits of its design. In the next few hours, that truth would be written in the burning hulls scattered across the Saipan plain. The first Hagos to close with the marine lines discovered the new equation in the most intimate way possible. At ranges under 200 meters, sometimes far closer, the Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns opened fire with armor-piercing ammunition. The deep, rhythmic thudding that Japanese crews had already begun to hear in the darkness now resolved into individual impacts. Sparks flashed across the riveted plates. Then the plates themselves gave way. The Type 95's armor had never been thick. At its strongest points the frontal plate measured only 12 millimeters. The sides and rear were thinner still. That steel had been sufficient against the rifle-caliber bullets and light shell fragments of earlier campaigns. It was never intended to stop a .50 caliber armor-piercing round traveling at over 2,800 feet per second. At close combat ranges the projectile carried enough kinetic energy to punch clean through the Hago's hull or turret, often continuing into the opposite side. The riveted construction made the problem worse. When a plate failed, the rivets themselves could become secondary projectiles inside the fighting compartment. Inside the tanks the effect was catastrophic and immediate. A single penetrating hit could kill or wound every man in the three-man crew. The driver, hunched over his levers, had almost no protection if a round entered from the front or side. The gunner, pressed against his sight, sat within inches of the thin turret wall. The commander, half exposed or crouched beneath the hatch, felt the shock of impacts through the metal itself. Smoke, flame, and the sharp stench of burning paint and human flesh filled the tiny interior within seconds. Some crews never even managed to return fire. Others fired a few rounds from the 37mm gun or the machine guns before a second or third .50 caliber burst finished the vehicle. The psychological shock was as destructive as the physical one. Tank crews are trained to trust their armor. They accept that heavier guns and specialized anti-tank weapons can defeat them, but they expect the steel shell around them to keep out the ordinary weapons of the battlefield: machine guns, rifles, mortars. When that expectation collapses, the tank ceases to feel like a protected fighting vehicle and becomes a steel coffin. On Saipan that night, Japanese tankers experienced exactly that collapse. The same 50 caliber machine guns that American infantry used against aircraft and light vehicles were now killing tanks. The realization spread from vehicle to vehicle as crews watched neighboring Hagos erupt in flame or grind to a halt with smoke pouring from every opening. It was not that the .50 caliber was a dedicated anti-tank weapon in the formal sense. It was that the combination of the Hagos' extreme thinness of armor, the availability of armor-piercing ammunition, and the close ranges of the night attack created a lethal intersection. American machine gunners, firing from prepared positions or from the mounts of half-tracks and tanks, simply had to keep their streams of fire on the advancing silhouettes. At those distances the mathematics of penetration favored the bullet. Some Japanese tanks still managed to close and engage. A few reached the marine lines and traded shots with infantry and supporting weapons. But the cost was already ruinous. Burning Hagos dotted the plain. Survivors who bailed out into the open found themselves under the same interlocking fire that had destroyed their vehicles. The advance that had begun with the familiar confidence of earlier campaigns was breaking apart under a weapon the crews had never seriously feared. And the .50 calibers were only the beginning. Behind the machine gun positions, larger threats were already moving into the fight. As the surviving Hagos pushed deeper into the marine perimeter, the next layer of American firepower arrived. Sherman tanks of the Marine tank battalions, already positioned in support of the infantry, began to move forward through the same darkness the Japanese had hoped to exploit. Their engines were deeper, heavier. Their silhouettes loomed larger against the intermittent light of star shells and burning vehicles. When they opened fire, the difference in scale became undeniable. The Type 95 Hago was a light tank built for a different war. It weighed roughly 7.5 tons. Its three-man crew shared every task inside a fighting compartment so small that the commander had to load the 37mm gun while also searching for targets and directing the driver. Armor was thin by any standard of 1944. Communication between tanks was limited, most relied on flags, hand signals, or shouted orders once the battle began. The machine was fast and mechanically simple, but it was never designed to trade blows with a modern medium tank. The M4 Sherman that met it on Saipan belonged to another category entirely. It weighed more than 30 tons. Its five-man crew had dedicated roles, a commander who could observe and direct without loading, a gunner focused solely on the target, a loader who kept the 75mm gun fed, a driver, and a bow machine gunner. The armor, while not invulnerable, was thick enough to shrug off the Hago's 37mm rounds at all but the closest ranges. The 75mm gun could destroy a Type 95 with a single hit almost anywhere on the vehicle. Every Sherman carried a radio, allowing coordinated movement and fire that the Japanese tanks could not match. In practical terms the mismatch was absolute. A Japanese commander standing in his open hatch, trying to spot targets, load his own gun, and keep his driver oriented, faced an American tank whose crew could engage him while remaining fully protected and in constant contact with neighboring vehicles and supporting infantry. The Sherman's greater weight and wider tracks gave it stability on the uneven coral ground. Its higher silhouette, once a liability in some European terrain, here simply provided better observation. When the two types of tank met in the dark, the Hago was not fighting a slightly superior version of itself. It was fighting a fundamentally different conception of armored warfare, one built around protection, firepower, crew efficiency, and communication. Some Japanese tanks still closed the distance and attempted to fight. A few managed to score hits on Shermans with their 37mm guns or to rake them with machine gun fire. Those hits rarely stopped the American vehicles. In return, a single well-placed 75mm round from a Sherman usually left the Hago burning or immobile. The Japanese crews, already shaken by the penetrating fire of the .50 calibers, now faced an enemy that could destroy them at ranges where their own guns were only marginally effective. The night attack that had been intended to smash the Marine beachhead instead became a series of unequal duels. Hagos that had survived the machine gun belts ran into Sherman guns. Those that tried to maneuver around the American armor found themselves caught in the interlocking fire of tanks, anti-tank guns, and infantry weapons. The speed and aggression that had once been the Hagos' greatest strengths were now spent against an opponent who could absorb the first shock and then answer with overwhelming force. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to touch the Saipan plain, the Japanese armored counterattack was effectively broken. Burning and abandoned Hagos littered the approaches to the marine lines. The survivors who still moved did so under the growing weight of American fire superiority. The tank that had carried Japanese crews through China, Malaya, and the Philippines had met a level of armored opposition it was never designed to survive. And even this unequal fight was only a symptom of a much larger imbalance. The burning Hagos on the Saipan plain were not simply the result of one tank design meeting another. They were the visible edge of a far deeper imbalance. Japan was fighting a modern industrial war against the United States, and the difference in industrial power shaped every aspect of the battlefield. The Americans did not merely bring better individual tanks to Saipan. They brought more of them, supported by more ammunition, more fuel, more radios, more spare parts, and a logistical system that could replace losses almost as quickly as they occurred. Behind every Sherman stood factories that produced them by the thousands, shipyards that carried them across the Pacific, and a training system that turned out new crews in a continuous stream. Behind every Japanese Hago stood an industrial base already stretched to its limit, short of steel, short of fuel, short of the specialized machine tools needed to produce heavier armor and more powerful guns in quantity. A tank does not exist alone. Its effectiveness depends on the industry, logistics, communications, maintenance, and production system that sustain it. The Hago had been designed in an era when Japan could still choose the kind of war it wanted to fight. Fast, limited, decided by maneuver against opponents of comparable or lesser industrial strength. By 1944 that choice no longer existed. The United States had turned the Pacific into a theater of material superiority. American forces arrived with mountains of supplies. Japanese forces arrived with what they could carry and what the dwindling merchant fleet could still deliver. When a Sherman was hit, another could often take its place within hours or days. When a Hago burned, its crew and its machine were usually gone for good. Radios illustrated the gap as clearly as armor thickness. American tanks and infantry units fought as a connected network. Japanese tanks still relied heavily on visual signals and prearranged plans that collapsed the moment the first vehicles were destroyed. Artillery support followed the same pattern. American observers could call down concentrations with speed and accuracy. Japanese artillery, short of shells and often cut off from forward observers, struggled to respond in time. Maintenance told the same story. American repair units worked under the protection of air and naval superiority. Japanese repair facilities, when they existed at all, were themselves under constant air attack. The result was cumulative. Each engagement left Japanese armored strength weaker while American strength remained constant or grew. The 9th Tank Regiment's attack on Saipan was not an isolated gamble. It was one of the last attempts to use tanks in the aggressive, mobile role for which the Hago had been built. After the losses of that night, remaining Japanese armor on the island was reduced to scattered vehicles that could no longer concentrate for a meaningful counterattack. The same pattern was already visible across the Central Pacific. Everywhere American forces landed, they brought with them the full weight of an industrial system that Japan could not match. The crews who died inside their Hagos on Saipan were not defeated solely by superior American tanks or by the penetrating power of 50 caliber machine guns. They were defeated by the larger reality that their machines belonged to an army whose industrial foundation could no longer keep pace with the demands of the war it was fighting. The thin armor and modest gun of the Type 95 were symptoms of that deeper condition. Even if Japan had produced a heavier, better-armed tank in 1944, it would still have faced the same shortages of fuel, spare parts, trained crews, and secure logistics that undermined every Japanese operation in the Marianas. The destruction of the Hagos was therefore both a tactical event and a strategic signal. It showed that the gap between the two sides had grown too wide for courage, skill, or aggressive doctrine to close. And that gap would only widen as the war moved farther west. The gap did not close. It widened with every island that followed. On Tinian, only days after the fall of Saipan, the remaining Japanese tanks were few and scattered. Those that still moved were committed in small, desperate counterattacks against the same combination of marine infantry, Shermans, and overwhelming supporting fire. The result was the same. Thin armor failed under .50 caliber and anti-tank gun fire. The 37mm guns scored almost no decisive hits. By the time the island was secured, Japanese armor had ceased to exist as a coherent force. On Peleliu the pattern hardened further. The Japanese garrison there chose a different approach. Instead of launching a large night attack across open ground, they dug their remaining tanks into prepared positions or held them in reserve for limited local counter-thrusts. The coral ridges and dense scrub offered some concealment, but they could not change the fundamental mismatch. When American forces closed in, the Hagos and the handful of medium still operational were destroyed one, by tank guns, by bazookas, by naval gunfire, by the steady attrition of an enemy who could replace every lost vehicle and every expended shell. The tanks that had once been instruments of rapid maneuver were reduced to static strongpoints, their mobility wasted, their thin plates offering little more protection than a reinforced bunker. Iwo Jima repeated the lesson in even starker form. Japanese armor on the island was minimal. The few tanks that remained were dug in or used as immobile gun positions. The volcanic ash and broken terrain made movement difficult even for the lighter Japanese machines, while American Shermans, supported by continuous naval and air bombardment, methodically eliminated every threat. Crews who had trained for aggressive advances now found themselves fighting from fixed positions, waiting for an enemy who arrived with numbers and firepower they could not match. The Hagos' original virtues, speed, mechanical simplicity, the ability to appear where least expected, had no place in a battle defined by prepared defenses and industrial mass. On Okinawa the final chapter unfolded. Japanese tank units, already depleted by earlier losses and by the difficulty of shipping vehicles through American submarine and air cordons, were committed in small groups or held back for the expected decisive counterattack that never fully materialized. When they did move, they faced the same overwhelming combination of Shermans, tank destroyers, artillery, and infantry anti-tank weapons. Some fought with the old aggressive spirit, attempting to close and disrupt American advances. Most were destroyed before they could achieve anything lasting. Others were reserved for the final defense of the southern lines, where they served as little more than mobile pillboxes until American fire found them. Across these battles a single pattern emerged. Japanese tanks no longer possessed any realistic chance in open armored warfare against American forces. The combination of thin armor, limited firepower, scarce radios, and the absence of a supporting industrial system left them vulnerable at every level. Commanders adapted as best they could, shifting from mobile counterattacks to defensive or static roles, but adaptation could not overcome the material disparity. The Type 95 Hago, once a symbol of Japanese armored success, became instead a symbol of how far the battlefield had moved beyond the assumptions of the 1930s. Saipan had not been an isolated disaster. It had been the moment when the accumulated weaknesses of Japanese armor were exposed in concentrated form. Every subsequent island simply confirmed what the burning hulls on the Charan-Kanoa plain had already shown: the age of the light tank as an instrument of decisive maneuver in the Pacific was over. The machines and the crews who fought inside them were now fighting a war that had outgrown them. And the deepest reason for that outgrowing was not any single American weapon. It was time itself. The Type 95 Hago had been designed in the early 1930s for a war that still looked, in Japanese eyes, like a contest of maneuver across the open spaces and limited infrastructure of East Asia. Its creators had made rational choices for that expected battlefield. Lightweight for mobility, thin armor for speed and affordability, a modest gun sufficient against the opponents they anticipated, and a simple mechanical layout that could be produced and maintained under the industrial constraints of the period. Those choices were not foolish. They matched the strategic horizon of the moment. But the horizon moved. By 1944 the nature of armored warfare had changed in ways the Ha-Go's designers could not fully anticipate and Japan's industry could not fully answer. Guns had grown more powerful. The 37mm that had been adequate against light fortifications and early tanks was now outclassed by the 75mm weapons carried by American mediums and by the high-velocity anti-tank guns that accompanied every U.S. landing force. Armor requirements had risen in parallel. What had once been acceptable protection against rifle-caliber fire and light shell fragments was now little more than an invitation to penetration by weapons that had become standard. Radios, once a luxury, had become essential. Combined arms coordination, tanks working seamlessly with infantry, artillery, and aircraft, had matured into a sophisticated system that rewarded continuous communication and punished isolation. Anti-tank weapons themselves had proliferated and improved, from the 50 caliber machine gun with armor-piercing ammunition to the bazooka, the recoilless rifle, and the dense concentrations of conventional anti-tank guns that American forces brought ashore as a matter of routine. Above all, industrial production had become decisive. The side that could build more tanks, more shells, more spare parts, and more trained crews held an advantage that no amount of individual skill or aggressive doctrine could erase. Japan's industrial base, already strained by the demands of a multi-front war and by the progressive loss of shipping and resources, could not keep pace. The United States, by contrast, turned out Shermans by the tens of thousands and sustained them across an ocean with a logistical system of unprecedented scale. The Ha-Go did not suddenly become a bad tank on the night of June 16, 1944. The battlefield had evolved beyond what the tank was built to survive. Its thin plates, adequate in 1937 against Chinese forces, were inadequate against the weapons of 1944. Its three-man crew arrangement, efficient for a light vehicle in earlier campaigns, left the commander overloaded in a fight that demanded rapid observation, precise gunnery, and constant communication. Its speed, once a decisive advantage against slower or absent enemy armor, now only brought it more quickly into the killing zones of an enemy who owned the night with star shells and the day with air superiority. Time had done what no single opposing tank design could have accomplished alone. It had rendered the original assumptions obsolete. The same machine that had carried Japanese crews from the Chinese plains to the tip of Malaya now carried them into a fight where every one of its defining characteristics had become a liability. The crews who trusted it on Saipan were not wrong to trust the record of earlier victories. They were simply fighting in a present that no longer resembled the past that had shaped their confidence. That is the quieter tragedy beneath the burning wrecks. The Ha-Go was not a failure of engineering so much as a casualty of history's acceleration. The war it was built for had already ended. The war that replaced it demanded a different kind of tank, a different kind of industry, and a different kind of time Japan no longer possessed. On the coral plain of Saipan, that truth was written in steel and fire. The final measure of the Ha-Go's story is not that American weapons were better. It is that the clock had run out on the world the Type 95 was made to inhabit. 1944, on the black coral plain of Saipan. The engines of the 9th Tank Regiment coughed to life. Inside each Type 95 Ha-Go, 3 men sit in the familiar closeness of steel and heat. The commander stands half-exposed in the turret, scanning the darkness. The gunner checks his 37mm rounds. The driver waits for the signal to move. They trust the armor around them because that armor has carried Japanese crews through years of warfare. They believe the machine will do once more what it has always done, close the distance, break the line, and open the way for victory. By the end of that night the limits of that protection have been brutally exposed. Burning hulls litter the approaches to the marine positions. Survivors who crawled from the wrecks have been cut down by the same fire that destroyed their tanks. The 50 caliber machine guns that should never have been a mortal threat have punched through 12 millimeters of steel as if it were paper. The Shermans that followed have finished what the heavy machine guns began. The aggressive counterattack that was meant to hurl the Americans back into the sea has instead become one of the clearest demonstrations of how far Japanese armor had fallen behind. The Ha-Go succeeded in the environment it was originally designed for. In the early 1930s, its combination of speed, simplicity, and modest firepower matched the war Japan expected to fight across the continents of Asia. In China, it faced opponents who lacked modern anti-tank weapons. In Malaya and the Philippines, it exploited surprise, terrain, and the absence of serious armored opposition. Those victories were real. The confidence they created in Japanese crews was earned under fire. Warnings about its limitations had existed. At Khalkhin Gol in 1939, the same thin armor and modest gun had already proven inadequate against Soviet tanks and anti-tank guns. The lesson was visible. It was not fully absorbed. Japan's industrial capacity, strategic priorities, and institutional culture did not permit a rapid transformation of its armored forces. Production continued. Doctrine remained aggressive. The early Pacific victories that followed only reinforced the belief that the existing tools were still sufficient. By the time the war reached Saipan, the gap between the Ha-Go and American firepower had become overwhelming. The battlefield itself had changed. Guns were heavier. Armor requirements were higher. Radios and combined arms coordination had become decisive. Industrial production and logistics now determined what an army could sustain. The Type 95, still essentially the same machine that had left the drawing boards a decade earlier, was asked to fight in a war that had outgrown every one of its original assumptions. The crews who climbed into those tanks on the night of June 16 were not fools. They were men who trusted the record of their own experience. That record had been written in a different war. The armor that failed them on Saipan had never been meant to stop the weapons of 1944. The speed that once delivered shock now only delivered them more quickly into the killing zone. The simplicity that once made the tank affordable and reliable now left it unable to evolve with the demands of industrial conflict. In the end, the Ha-Go was not simply outgunned or outarmored. It was out of time. It was a tank built for yesterday's war, committed to a battle that already belonged to tomorrow. The burning wrecks on the Saipan plain marked more than the failure of one night's attack. They marked the moment when the accumulated weight of history, industry, and technological change finally crushed the assumptions of the early 1930s. The men who died inside those machines paid the price for a gap that no amount of courage could close. Their trust in the steel around them was the final echo of a design philosophy that had once made sense, and that the war had long since left behind.